Hello, I'm back again. In this episode, I'll be making a few decorative pieces to go along with the cave tiles that we made in the last video. So that will include things like giant mushroom patches, these crystal clusters or ice formations, and also good old-fashioned stalagmites. And to make things a little easier, I've supplied the textures for these pieces on 3 separate sheets, as you can see here. So if you're just looking to make lots of stalagmites, for example, you don't need to waste ink printing out any of the other stuff. Okay then, I'll start things off with the giant mushrooms, and for these we're going to need a few different sized drinking straws. So on the right is the kind of milkshake variety, in the middle is a regular sized one, and on the left is the kind you might get with a small carton of juice. Okay, the first thing you need to do is to just rough up the drinking straw with a bit of sandpaper. Then we're going to cut out a piece of the stem texture that's big enough to wrap around the entire straw. And if we then apply some glue to the back of that texture, we can then glue it in place. So something like this. Now for the top of the mushrooms, you've probably noticed that I've made 2 different size textures, a smaller one and a larger one. And I'm going to be using the larger one in this example, simply because I'm making a large mushroom. So I've just gone ahead and cut out a suitably sized piece, and we're then going to glue that to some thin cardboard, like so, and then put it to one side to dry. Okay, so once everything's had a few minutes to dry, we just need to mark out a circle. And for this, I'm using a circle template, but you could use a washer, or a miniatures base, or just freehand it if you prefer. Then we'll need to cut that out, keeping inside the line if possible, with a sharp pair of scissors. And there we go. So once that's done, I then like to cut out a few notches along the edge, maybe around 3 or 4 on something this size. And then I'll go along and add some small cuts as well. Basically, so it ends up looking something like the picture I've shown in the bottom corner. Okay, next we'll take the straw and we'll cut one end at a slight angle and the other one straight. And the reason for this is because we'll be gluing the top to the straight end, like you can see in the animation, and the angled end to the base, so that the whole thing leans slightly to one side. But before we can do that, we'll need to take a foam sheet or a mouse mat or something like that, and a large marble. And we can then give the top a slight domed shape by simply pressing the marble down onto the back of the piece, like you can see me doing here, and if all goes according to plan, it should end up looking something like this. There you go. Okay, so now it's time to glue everything together, and all we need to do here is apply plenty of hot glue to the underside of the top, like so, and then stick the straight end of the stalk in place. And there you go. Now all we need to do is make a few more, and as luck would have it, here's a few I made earlier, and the only difference here is that I've used the smaller texture for the tops, and obviously different size straws for the stems. Right then, for a base, you can either use any offcuts you might have from the cave tiles, or make one from the gridless cave texture itself, and all that's left to do is glue everything in place. And when we're done, it should end up looking something like this. But if I just pause the video for a second here, you can see how angling the stems a little bit has it's allowed us to glue the mushrooms closer together, and given us a more realistic look. So yeah, it's as easy as that, and with just one printout you should be able to make quite a few of these pieces. Okay, so next we're going to make some crystals, and for these we'll need a sheet of foam board. Then, using a ruler and sharp knife, we can cut out several strips, and in this example I'm looking to make them roughly as wide as they are thick. Next, we'll need to cut out some of the crystal texture that's roughly the same length as these strips, and then trim that into pieces that are wide enough to wrap around the foam board. So something like that. Then, if you hadn't already guessed, we'll apply some glue to the back of the texture, and then wrap it tightly around the foam board. Like so. Now, you really need to give that plenty of time to dry before moving on to the next stage, or it will just tear when you try to cut it. And it's also worth mentioning that I'm using a new blade here as well. So all I'm doing is slicing one end off at an angle, and then standing the piece up on the table just to get an idea of how tall I'd like it to be, and then slicing the other end off at a different angle. So something like this. Next, we'll need to cover up one of the exposed ends, and for this, we're just going to use an offcut from the crystal texture. And the way I like to do this is by cutting out a slightly oversized piece to begin with, then I'll drop it on top to get an idea of how big it needs to be, and then just trim it to size by eye. Then we can apply some glue to both pieces and stick the texture in place. So there's the finished piece, and all we need to do now is make a bunch more, all of them different sizes, with the ends cut at a variety of angles. Okay, so here's a base I've made by gluing a piece of the cave texture to some cardboard, and all I'm going to do next is hot glue one of the larger, more upright crystals somewhere near the centre. So something like that. Then it's just a matter of gluing the remaining crystals around it, and try and do this so that the larger, more upright ones are near the middle and the smaller ones are around the outside. So here I am doing that, but as you can see, I like to try out a few different crystals in various locations before I glue them in place, just to try and get a nice cluster that's spreading outwards from the centre. And in this particular example, I've ended up with an area that's a little too open for my liking, so I'm going to trim one of the spare crystals so that it fills that gap, and then glue it to the side of one of the other ones. And yeah, it's a little hard to see exactly what I'm doing here, but if you look at the animation on the left there, hopefully that helps to explain it a bit better. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and do that again in one more area, and then we'll call this one done. So there you go. They are a bit more involved than the mushrooms, but once again, one printout should be more than enough to make quite a few of them. Okay, so the final thing we're going to have a go at making today are some stalagmites. And for these, the first thing we need to do is take a piece of scrap paper, scrunch it up a few times to make it more malleable, and then squash it together to form the basic shape. So, something similar to that. Then we'll take some of the stone texture, and I'll just make sure I've got enough here to wrap around the piece. And we'll scrunch that up a few times as well, once again, just to make it more malleable. Okay, once we're happy with that, we'll open it back out and apply some glue to the back. Then we can wrap the texture around the piece, though this can be a little tricky at first, but you soon get the hang of it. And because I've used a bit too much of the texture in this example, I'm just going to trim off some of the excess, perhaps leaving around 1/4 of an inch overhang. Then we'll need to take some greaseproof paper, or parchment paper I think it's sometimes called, and press the stalagmite down onto that. And the idea here is to squash that extra 1/4 of an inch overhang that we had, to squash that nice and flat, so that it forms a kind of base. And while we're at it, it's also a good idea to push the texture into all the nooks and crannies of the scrap paper interior piece, just to give it a bit of added texture. And there we go. At this stage, it should look something like this. Right then, once it's had a few minutes to dry, it should peel straight off the paper, and I then like to tidy up the edges a little bit, just with a pair of scissors. So it looks something like that, and then I'll take another base that I got ready beforehand, and this time I'm just using the glue stick to glue it in place. And there you have it, one finished stalagmite. Okay, so obviously you can glue more than one stalagmite to a base, like you can see in this picture here, or even mix and match the pieces however you like. But that's it for another one, so as always, if you have any comments or questions, post them below, and I look forward to reading through them. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.